For our project, Sam Tatum and I will be doing the Cold War. Let's start off with some basic information. The Cold War, dated from 1947 to 1991, was a continued state of tension between the powers of the United States and the Western Bloc, and of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. But mainly it was between the U.S. and the USSR. The Cold War was a series of separate events that collectively made up and defined the Cold War. And it was named the Cold War because both major powers possessed nuclear weapons and therefore felt threatened by the other. But no fighting actually occurred between the two, hence a Cold War, a war not heated by direct battle or conflict. The Cold War was a struggle of global influence, political and military ideas, and of social influence, who had more as far as Europe was concerned. And they met indirectly in proxy wars, and then they met directly through psychological warfare.
Let's go back to the separate groups involved. The Eastern Bloc was made up of the Allied Communist states of Eastern and Central Europe, with Soviet Russia at the head. The Communist states involved were Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Albania, and obviously the Soviet Union. These communist states were allied through the Warsaw Pact, a mutual defense treaty that was established under the initiative of the Soviet Union in 1955.
And then on the other hand, the Western Bloc consisted of the United States and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance based on a system of collective defense, very much like the Warsaw Pact that comes later. And this was established in 1949. The Western Bloc consisted of Canada, the United States, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark and Iceland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and Britain.
Western Bloc referred to themselves as the Free World, as they consisted of democratic countries and nations against the communist ideas of the Eastern Bloc. So in many ways it can be argued that the main conflict of the Cold War was one based on the differences in beliefs of communism and democracy, or at least this is what spurred many events in the Cold War.
During World War II, the Soviet Union and the USA formed an alliance of convenience against Nazi Germany. So they were brought together, and they were allies because of a common enemy that they shared, but nothing more than that. And then after Germany was defeated, it was clear to both powers that they had major differences and disputes, and they were no longer tied together by this common enemy in Nazi Germany. So tensions began to arise directly after the war, beginning with a race to Berlin between the U.S. and Russia. And now it was clear that there were two major powers in the world, and they were in competition. Their disputes consisted of a post-war Europe, who would have influence and control in these newly defeated areas, and in this post-war Europe. And they came to light through the post-war conferences, for example, the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference.
They disagreed about the new European map and the drawing of borders, as well as the establishment and maintenance of post-war security throughout Europe. In other words, they disagreed on whether to establish a security system through democratic government or through the domination of internal affairs through communism.
Finally, after the tension-filled conferences, it was agreed upon that Germany would be split into occupation zones, with a Soviet occupation zone on the eastern side, Britain and United States occupation zones on the western side, and a French occupation zone on the western side as well.
Although it technically lied in the Soviet occupation zone, Berlin was split into the same occupation zones as the country was, despite its location. The reason for this was because the city was so important and had proved so important before and during the war that all of the Allied nations felt the need to be present and to occupy some part of the city.
And since the Cold War branched off into many separate events throughout the duration of the war, events involving different nations around the world, we're going to cover the material by category of events and nations, as opposed to covering the material in chronological order. And since we're on the topic, we will start with Germany. After these occupation zones were established after the war, the United States and Britain, later France, merged their occupation zones into one large zone in order to create a federal governmental system, which in 1949, with the addition of France, became the Federal Republic of Germany, or better known as West Germany. In this, they began to reindustrialize and build up the German economy once again.
In an attempt to stop this and to take over control of the entire city, have it under Soviet and Communist command, Stalin instituted the Berlin blockade, one of the first major crises of the Cold War. In this, the Soviet Union blockaded the Allies' access into West Berlin, which cut off the food, materials, and supplies being brought into West Berlin by the Allies. The Soviets' goal was to eventually force the Western powers to allow the Soviet side to provide Western Berlin with the supplies and food they need for the sake of their people, which by doing so would basically give Soviet Russia control over the whole city.
In response to this, the Allies or Western powers organized the Berlin Airlift to fly supplies over the blockade and into Western Berlin. As simple as pie. They actually ended up accomplishing more by doing this than they had in the first place. And then in May 1949, Stalin backed down and the blockade was lifted. This was one of the major crises of the Cold War. Okay, so let's jump ahead a few years. Berlin, along with Germany as a whole, was still split into East and West Germany at the beginning of the 1960s. And every year, thousands and thousands of Germans snuck out of East Germany into West Germany through Berlin, through a quote-unquote loophole in the system that was designed to keep them in East Germany.
This became a real problem for the Eastern Bloc in East Germany, as many of these people leaving for West Germany were young, brilliant, and very valuable minds, and there was what is referred to as a brain drain between the two sides of the country.
So, in 1961, to prevent this from occurring any more than it already had, and to enforce the system and to keep those valuable minds, East Germany and the Soviet Union physically created a fence, a barrier between the two sides of Berlin that eventually became the Berlin Wall, complete with a solid concrete barrier and guard towers to shoot anyone who tried to cross this barrier.
Let's skip ahead another few decades. Throughout Eastern and Central Europe during the end of the 1980s, revolutions and radical political changes occurred with many of the communist states within the Eastern Bloc, a series of events known as the revolutions of 1989 or collapse of communism. These revolutions and political changes were a direct result of liberalization within the political systems of the Eastern Bloc, something we will discuss later on. One of the states where this occurred was in East Germany. After weeks of domestic unrest within the East German government, it was announced that citizens of East Germany could visit and travel through to West Germany and West Berlin by crossing the Berlin Wall.
Sure enough, they were allowed to do so, and the walls were flooded from both sides in celebration, and eventually over the next few weeks the wall was chipped away and completely demolished in 1990. With the fall of the Berlin Wall came German reunification between East and West Germany in 1990.
Now that we've dealt with the Cold War and its effect in Germany, let's look at the war in regards to Europe as a whole. After the events of post-World War II, tensions were rising as both were apprehensive of the other's political standpoint and power. Soviets believed that the U.S. were attempting to build up military power in Europe, which they made known through the Novikov telegram. And on the other end, the Western powers in the U.S. and Britain had this idea of the USSR attempting to make an Iron Curtain, physically and ideologically, to block themselves and the other countries linked to them off from the rest of Europe. Tensions between the two powers rising, in 1947, Soviet Russia created the forum Common Forum, the purpose of which was to tighten political control and communist control over the Soviet satellite countries through political parties within the Eastern Bloc.
The response to this, and to the growth and strength of Soviet Russia's communist power in Europe, was the nation's adoption of the policy of containment, a policy of using many strategies in order to prevent the spread of communism abroad, which was the common goal of this policy. One of the ways containment was applied was through the Truman Doctrine, a policy stating that the U.S. would support Turkey and Greece, two countries battling and struggling against Russia in their attempt to bring them into the Soviet sphere of communism, which the U.S. were trying to prevent from happening. The Truman Doctrine is labeled by some as the beginning of the Cold War. Part of the policy of containment was the domino theory, the theory that if one thing falls into communism, more will follow and communism will spread and grow, and so the line has to be held or contained. This containment and the domino theory will come into play later on in the war.
Another event that added to the tensions between the two countries in a post-war Europe and helped to create a distinct split was the Marshall Conflict. For a post-war Europe, the USA enacted their plan, the Marshall Plan, which was a plan of economic assistance for all willing countries in Europe. The goal of this plan was to rebuild democratic and economic systems in Europe, to keep the balance of power, and to keep the communist parties from trying to create empires or revolutions from occurring.
Stalin did not want economic unity between all of Europe, as he felt that it would allow for countries in the Eastern Bloc to escape Soviet control, and he felt that the U.S. was only doing this to build up power in Europe. So, he did not allow for any of the countries of the Eastern Bloc to receive the Marshall Plan, and instead the Soviet Union, in response, created Comecon, which was Economic Council, or Council for Economic Assistance among the countries of the Eastern Bloc. Economically, it kept the communist states tied together.
April 1949, North Atlantic Treaty was signed, and NATO was established. We've already covered NATO to some extent, so we won't go into too much more detail, but the full extent of the Western Bloc was officially established through NATO.
And then on the other hand, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was established as well, and through this, the Eastern Bloc was officially established. And so all of these events collectively contributed to a divide in Europe and tension based on political standpoint through alliance systems, pacts, and ideas. And this is how it affected Europe.
Another major aspect of the Cold War was the spread of communism, hence the policy of containment outside of Europe. In China in 1949, there was a civil war, a communist revolution which was won by the People's Liberation Army, defeating the American-backed nationalist government in China at the time. People's Republic of China was established, a communist government system, and immediately the Soviets formed an alliance in order to add them to their repertoire of communist powers.
Because of this and the threat of growing communism in other places in the world, Truman and the U.S. looked to expand containment and to push it even more in new places, for example in places like Asia or Africa. So in order to do this, the U.S. formed alliances in these places in order to have military bases in these areas that they could count on. One of these was SEATO in 1954, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, created as stated before to block further communist gains in Southeast Asia.
One of the big events of this containment and the spread of this containment was the Korean War, the event of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, invading the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. So North Korea had an established communist government and South Korea had an established republic, leaning more towards democracy. You probably already guessed that both the Soviet Union and the United States were very much involved. Divided by the 38th parallel, U.S. troops in South Korea, while Soviet had troops in the North. Initially, Stalin was behind the North Koreans' war efforts, the People's Army, communicating war plans and directing the invasion.
Both sides provided troops and threw themselves into the Korean conflict and war, as well as the United Nations, who also provided the Republic of Korea with aid and troops alongside the U.S. in an attempt to stop the invasion. Stalin pushed and pushed for the war efforts to be maintained, and they were until his death in 1953, where the Armistice Treaty was approved to stop the conflict. Both were established as separate governments.
Another war based on communism and the spread of containment that tied into the Cold War was the Vietnam War, fought between the Communist North Vietnamese and the government of South Vietnam from 1955 to 1975, who very much resembled the Korean War, in that the North was supported by China, the Soviet Union, both communist countries, while the South was mainly supported by the U.S.
The war began with an anti-colonial revolution led by Ho Chi Minh to free Vietnam from French control, who were occupying Vietnam at the time. The French were successfully driven out, independence was won, and Ho Chi Minh gained a ton of support. When it was clear that he would win the elections that were to take place after independence was gained, some people refused to have the elections as he was a communist, and this caused a split between the North and the South. Because the South refused to hold the elections, there was an invasion by the North. This invasion is what led to the involvement of both sides based on communism for Soviet Russia and containment based on the domino theory for the United States.
Another country that played a tremendous part in the Cold War as far as growing communism and spreading containment was Cuba. This involvement came through a man by the name of Fidel Castro. In 1959, Fidel Castro, leader of the 26th of July movement, led the Cuban Revolution, through which he overthrew the Batista dictatorship of Cuba that was backed by the U.S. government. Through this, he came to power through a new government system that he established with himself at the head.
Castro, being a communist revolutionary and overthrowing a government backed by the U.S., along with his ties and relations to Soviet Russia, was not liked by the U.S. and the U.S. government, and America eventually cut off relations with Cuba as a result of Fidel Castro coming to power.
The U.S. government attempted various ways to remove Castro from office, but of those, the most famous and the most disastrous for the U.S. was the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs was an attempted military invasion by the CIA trained and funded counter-revolutionary military group Brigade 2506, made up of Cuban exiles.
The plan was for the Kennedy administration to train and to fund this military, who was to then, in turn, invade Cuba and overthrow Castro and his government. When the invading force entered Cuba, they were defeated by Castro and the Cuban armed forces in 3 days. This event was seen as a huge embarrassment to the U.S. for obvious reasons after such quick defeat. Castro's response to the Bay of Pigs invasion, that the U.S. government truly was responsible for, was to publicly embrace and accept communist ideology. And because of this, the Soviet Union made stronger relations with Cuba and promised to provide them with support in the future.
The U.S. still had ambitions to take Castro out of power and attempted to do so however they could. One plan to do this that was looked upon with high hopes for success was the Cuban Project, the CIA's secret operation of terrorism against Cuba to remove the communists from power. The goal of the operation was to create revolt in Cuba and to help instigate the overthrow of the communist regime. But in 1962, Khrushchev found out of this plan, and along with the U.S.'s plan in general, to assassinate Castro and organize the overthrow of the Cuban government, and so, in response, the Soviet Union prepared to install nuclear missiles into Cuba immediately.
And then in response to this, the U.S. attempted a naval blockade to directly stop this however they could. And so, the Soviet Union backed down and removed missiles while the U.S. had to pledge to not invade Cuba or attempt to invade Cuba again. This is the event in the Cold War where nuclear warfare was most imminent, and where the Cold War came its closest to becoming a nuclear war. It is a prime example of mutual assured destruction, the belief that the usage of weapons of mass destruction, such as in nuclear warfare, will inevitably result in the complete annihilation of both opposing sides, and nothing will be accomplished but wide-scale destruction. The two opposing sides were simply not ready for a war of this magnitude.
Another aspect of the Cold War that was very important and played a huge role throughout the war was the aspect of competition, mainly competition in the nuclear arms race and the space race. The threat of the other powers' nuclear warfare looming over their heads, both countries were constantly competing to better their nuclear warfare and to help develop it and assert their own power over the others. This nuclear competition eventually led to Sputnik in 1957, the world's first artificial Earth satellite successfully launched and put into space by the USSR. This event introduced a new aspect of this competition, a scientific competition between Russia and America. America realized that through this event, that scientifically, the USSR was ahead of them, and they were inferior as they had not yet before launched a satellite into space.
And so the space race came to be, a competition over supremacy in the exploration of space. They competed to be the first to achieve things that had not been achieved in space yet, such as the launching of satellites, orbital human spaceflight, and space travel, and putting a man on the moon.
Now that we've dealt with all of the separate aspects of the war, let's talk about the changes in the Soviet Union and how they led to the decline of the Soviet Union and the end of the war. Let's jump to 1985. In an attempt to make it seem as if the people of Russia had more freedom, Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of Soviet Russia, implemented the policies of glasnost and perestroika. Let's talk about perestroika first. Perestroika refers to the reconstruction of political and economic system established by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. The political goal of perestroika was to reform the political system in the USSR to mimic those of the Western countries. Contested elections were introduced to give the people a small voice in the government. Economically, perestroika ended the price controls set by the communist government for nearly 7 decades. The economic goal of perestroika was to set up a semi-free market system, emulating those of the US, Germany, and Japan. Glasnost, meaning openness, refers to political and social reforms aimed at giving the Russian people more freedom. Goals of Glasnost was to give the Russian people freedom of speech and also stop censorship of the media. This new freedom allowed for journalists to report on government corruption and the awful, poverty-stricken state of the Soviet people. Lack of regulation was in a scary way for the Soviet people who had been accustomed to the iron fist of the communist government for so long. The sudden mass release of information regarding political corruption in the state of the Soviet Union caused a widespread panic in the country, ultimately led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Instead of working as a step toward becoming more like Western nations, Glasnost and Perestroika hurt the country more than it helped.
One of the direct results of Glasnost Perestroika and the new freedom it gave was the emergence of nationalist movements and revolutions throughout the satellite states in the Eastern Bloc. As mentioned before when discussing the unification of Germany and the destruction of the Berlin Wall, there was what was referred to as the collapse of communism in 1989, a decline in communist systems throughout Europe. In response to these revolutions and the decline of Soviet Russia's power, Gorbachev was under pressure to give even greater democracy to the republics than he already had, through elections for a new legislative body in the USSR. By 1991, nations and republics incorporated into the Soviet Union were successfully regaining their independence, and there was political unrest in the Soviet Union. This led the Communist Party to drastic measures in attempting a coup d'etat to get rid of Gorbachev and re-establish the strong, central, authoritarian government that had once been. The coup was unsuccessful, yet made the Russian people fearful that the reforms could be repealed, as well as the republics that had regained their independence. And as a result, in December of 1991, the presidents of the Soviet republics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus came together in agreement to dissolve the Soviet Union and replace it with the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev was powerless in the face of events, and he resigned on Christmas Day of 1991, formally ending the existence of Soviet Union. And so, the Cold War no longer existed, as there was no opposing communism that existed in terms of a system of government in Russia, and the conflict was officially over.
The end! We're done!